Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody here. My name is Rene Zamora. I'll be moderating the first session. I support the Initiative 20 by 20 at the Water Resources Institute. We are very happy to be here in this first series of policy dialogues that we will discuss many important things around policies in restoration. This is part of our new program on policy acceleration that we started last week with a cohort of 6 countries. And we will start the discussion not just for Latin America, but for Africa, India, and other regions. So this is the starting point or a truly global program. So thank you, everybody. We have interpretation in the low corner. If you see the Earth icon, we have interpretation to Spanish and Portuguese, so you can choose your language there if in case you need. With that, I would like to start by introducing the Global Restoration Director at the Water Resources Institute, Sean DeWitt, who will give us the welcome address for this dialogue. Sean, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rene, and welcome everyone to our inaugural global dialogue of the Policy Accelerator. We're really excited that you've joined us. This will be the first of 3 global dialogues that we'll be facilitating in 2021. This is the global dialogue on policy instruments and incentives. On the 19th of October, we will have a session on carbon markets. And on the 1st of December, we'll have a session on low carbon agriculture and agroecology incentives. So please do join us for each of those global dialogues if you find this useful. I would like to thank Walter, Renee, Maggie, Victoria, Mary, the team, fellow panelists and speakers today, and for each of you for taking time to share on policy instruments and incentives. Indeed, this is an important topic if we're going to scale solutions in the nature space. I think we all know that getting these enabling conditions and the mix of public incentives right is absolutely key. One last thing before we move, I'd like to just thank, I know on the line we have Simon from the Good Energies Foundation, and I think shortly joining us will be Adi Almos from HSBC's Sustainability Unit in Latin America. I want to thank them both for their support for the Policy Accelerator and for these global dialogues. So with that, why are we talking about public incentives today? As I mentioned, I think we all know these are key to scaling some of the solutions that are already underway around the world, but it's not easy to get these policies right. There's often issues that come up in the design of the policies. There's sometimes issues that come up in the capitalization of the policies. We have to make the right economic case to the Ministry of Finance that these policies should be capitalized at a sufficient level to have meaningful impact. There's often issues that come up in the implementation of these policies and how they're rolled out and how the regulations are written and interpreted and in practice done in the field. And then there's also just the issue of harmonizing these policies. Each of them in a vacuum can make sense, but there may be other policies in the system that are in direct conflict with those policies. And so making sure that there is a harmonized approach across sectors is really key too. So getting all of that right is not easy. This is why we started the Policy Accelerator program. We noticed a gap in allowing policymakers to connect with each other, both within countries and across countries, to share some of the best knowledge that they've been able to learn over the years and to share some of the issues that they're facing, and to be able to workshop some of those issues together in a peer-to-peer format. We believe public sector innovation is not only possible, but it's extremely important, and it's actually really exciting. So we're super excited about this Policy Accelerator. Right now, we've just launched a new cohort, as Renee mentioned last week. We're working with ministers and national directors across environment ministries, agriculture, and finance to identify some of those policy bottlenecks in country, and then connecting this cohort of 52 government officials from 6 countries. That includes Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Costa Rica, to build a really strong network of these public sector innovators across Latin America. So we're incredibly excited about that process. We're equally excited, though, about these global dialogues where we can really start to tease out some of the key issues that do need to be addressed in these policy regimes. So with no further ado, I'd love to turn it over to my colleague, Walter Vergara, who will provide some additional remarks as we open. Walter, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Renee, and my colleagues at the Initiative 2020 for continuing to organize these trailblazing events on policy and restoration. I also want to welcome everybody here. I noticed that there are 180 plus participants. Welcome all of you to this event. I would like to thank in particular David from FAO, who is the manager of the Forest Farm Facility, for agreeing to provide a keynote address, as well as to Jennifer Alex Garcia from Oregon State University. And I'm not surprised that Oregon State University is represented in this event. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our panelists, Tangu Isabel Tumeo from Malawi, Ramon Silva from Conafor in Mexico, our colleague Ruchika Singh from WRI India, and thank Maggie for moderating the panel. And also would like to thank Aide Olmos, as well as Viviana Lujan, who I understand is attending, for the strong support that HSBC is providing to this particular effort. Now, before we start, I just want to mention that policy and incentives are central to the efforts in restoration in Latin America. As you know, the initiative has 3 pillars, one of them dedicated to policy and decision making. And why is that? Because why are we paying so much attention to policy issues? Well, restoration is central to the climate change policies in the region. Nature-based solutions, restoration, conservation are important in the climate change agenda because they account for a majority of emissions. Therefore, any policy decisions, any plans to address mitigation and adaptation concerns before the Secretariat to the United Nations have to be centered in the region on policies regarding restoration and nature-based solutions. It's the same thing with biodiversity. Our policies in the region on biodiversity, which will be shaped more closely after the post-2020 meeting in China later this year, need to be centered on restoration issues and conservation issues, as 40% of global biodiversity, global terrestrial biodiversity, is in our countries in Latin America. And finally, restoration, nature-based solutions policies, conservation policies are central to food security in the region and to policies on food security. The region now accounts for 13% of the global trade of food and fiber and is bound to grow. So you see the centrality of policy in these 3 different agendas: climate, biodiversity, and food security. Finally, I'd like to remind you guys that there has been a lot of progress, and the countries have to be commended for this. There are now national restoration agendas and policies on restoration in many of the countries that participate in Initiative 2020. So with that background, we see a lot of potential for this dialogue, a lot of potential that is centered on priorities, policy making, incentive making policies in Latin America for the 3 agendas. Again, climate change, biodiversity, food security. So welcome you all. I do hope, as Sean remarked, and I hope and I understand that this initial effort on policy will continue with your interest, with your participation, to make it a success. By the end of the year, we'll have a series of events wrapping up the effort. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Maggie, all my colleagues at 20 by 20, our communication colleagues, Jane and Will, thanks as well for making this possible. And I go back to Renee now.
Thank you, Walter, for the words, and just continuing with the agenda and the program. So as my colleague mentioned, we are putting together these dialogues in an effort to create this innovation in the public sector. many people tend to believe that policies are very rigid and there is not much room to change. But there are specific cases where we have seen changes and there is a lot of innovation in the public sector that some call public entrepreneurship. So that's why we are here, and the idea is also to bring together the different regions around the world. You know, Latin America, Africa, Asia. We have so many things to share and things in common. We tend to think that maybe we are different, but not when you see the problems in policies that are around many parts of the world are very similar, especially in the South. No, and we probably have some lessons to co-create and learn. With that, I would like to pass to the next session, which is our keynotes. Our first keynote is Dr. David Kaimowitz, that I happened to have the opportunity to meet many years ago when I was a student, forestry student in Nicaragua. And now David, at that time, David was director of C4. But right now, David Kaimowitz is a forest and farm facility manager at FAO. And he's working with extensive experience as a manager in rural policy, grant maker, communications strategies, and fundraiser. He previously directed the Ford Foundation, also was, as I mentioned, Director General of the Center of International Forestry Research. And he worked also for the International Institute of Cooperation in Agriculture, the International Service for National Agricultural Research, and the Ministry of Agricultural Development and Agrarian Reform in Nicaragua. So David, it's an honor to have you here to share with us your experience and what you have seen in terms of policies. And so please, and I will ask my colleague Jerry if she can upload the presentation so we can start. So the floor is yours, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee, and thanks to WRI for inviting me to this very interesting event. From the moment when they said that this was going to focus on what could be done in terms of innovations of policies that didn't necessarily involve a new law or a new major national policy, but things that could be done at kind of the middle level, management level, it seemed like a very interesting idea to me, and I'm very happy to be here. I'll be talking today about challenges and opportunities in tenure and regulatory policies affecting forest landscape restoration. And when I talk about forest landscape restoration, I'll mostly be talking about planting trees, natural regeneration of trees, and managing of existing trees for restoration. Often when we talk about forest landscape restoration, there is some mention to the fact that tenure is very important. But when we actually look at the work being done, it usually doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. And it may seem a bit strange to be talking about tenure and regulatory policies together, but in essence, those two things together really define what rights farmers and communities have over their forests and trees, and how they are able to benefit from them in terms of those rights. Next slide, please. And the reason that tenure and regulatory policies are so important for this topic is because there are many countries in many contexts around the world where tenure policies and regulatory policies right now are one of the main obstacles, if not the main obstacle, that is discouraging forest restoration. And I'll be pointing out a number of examples of that today, but I don't want to pick on countries per se. I just want to get the general concepts across here. Where farmers lack rights to harvest the trees, to log the trees, to harvest from the trees that they plant or let grow, obviously they have a lot less incentive to want to plant trees or let trees grow. There's also lots of situations where, because of tenure problems, communities feel that they can't protect the land that they have from outside invasion or from forest fires or other types of outside disturbances. And if they can't protect the land and their forest, again, there's much less incentive for them to be actively restoring it and regenerating it. There's other situations, on the other hand, where the reason people clear forests and get rid of the forests is because in a lot of countries that is a pathway to getting land rights. So the land tenure situation is set up in such a way that people feel that for them to be on the land or to control the land, they actually have to clear the forests. Although in some cases we have the opposite going on, where planting trees, people do it in part because they see it as a way to achieve clear land rights or tree rights as well. When we get to the regulatory side, villagers often find it too hard or too costly to supply forest products legally. There's too much red tape, too many meetings, too many forms they have to fill out, too many bribes they have to pay. And as a result, they say, with these sort of regulations, I might as well do something else. And in fact, they often do. And finally, even though legally in most countries these days, women and men have equal rights, in practice, the way policies are being implemented in many countries tend to marginalize women, not include them in all sorts of different ways. Many customary rules and regulations marginalize women, and that directly reduces the possibility that women can contribute to forest landscape restoration. And if we go look at a situation like Africa, for example, where most farmers are women, that's particularly disturbing. Next, please. So I'll be talking about different examples to kind of point out these issues. And starting with that of tree tenure in Ghanaian cocoa farms. The general principle is that lack of secure rights make farmers less inclined to have timber trees in their cocoa farms. That's a general principle, and it may sound like the easy way to solve that problem is just give them a title to their land or a law that says you have a right to the timber trees. But in practice, it's much more complicated, and that's what I want to get at with this slide. Ghana, for example, recognizes farmers' rights to planted trees, but not the trees that regrow on their own. That might make sense in theory, but in reality, it's almost impossible to tell one of those trees from the other. And so that makes the farmers very insecure, even if they've planted the trees. Many different types of actors. We're not just talking about small farmers being the only actors in these formal and informal tree rights situations. We have communal landholding, we have traditional authorities, we have sharecroppers, we have migrants, we have women, men, and depending on where they fit into the system, they may have more actual rights, no matter what the law says, more tenure security, and that's something that we're going to have to figure out. So it's not going to be easy to make laws for such a complex system. We're going to have to look for solutions that are much more adapted to the local specific context, because one set of laws isn't going to be able to deal with so many actors and situations. And if we think about titling, one of the things, for example, that the Forestry Commission in Ghana has proposed is to have a formal land registry with a formal forest registry so that we know exactly whose land is what and whose trees were planted and belong to the individual farmers. But that turns out to be very costly, turns out to be very inequitable in terms of who can participate, and these registries are quickly outdated. So the innovation that we're seeing in Ghana, but we're also seeing in other countries, is experimenting with more informal agreements, more ways of bringing the communities together to informally agree on which rights will exist, and have the communities themselves document that, and that has shown some real promise. Next, please. If we turn from Africa to Latin America, again, we see that it's not just a matter of official title. Latin America in general is very advanced compared to other regions in the world in terms of indigenous communities having title to their land. About 2/3 of the indigenous forest area in Latin America does have title. But the reality is that in many contexts, those titles are not sufficient, even though studies consistently show that they do help. And one clear recent example of that is the Bolivian indigenous territories in lowland Bolivia. The Chiquitano communities in particular there have legal title over large areas of forests. They've been sustainably managing these natural forests and planting trees with a lot of success. But in the last couple of years, they've faced some real problems, similar to other parts of Latin America. The fires have been extensive and have really destroyed a lot of their forests. They're increasingly being invaded by migrants, by settlers, by ranchers, despite the fact they have title. And that's tended to take them away from wanting to restore forests or maintain forests and move to crops and livestock. Title has not been enough because the title would not give secure tenure unless the government and local other stakeholders, settlers, would recognize that title. And so what we need to address in that context is attitudes among public officials, so that they see the importance of maintaining these forests and securing these land rights, and addressing head-on the issue of racism, which is often underlying some of these problems. Next, please. When it gets to the very, very important question of women's tenure rights and women's land rights, I want to share an interesting example from Benin that was based on a study that was done in Benin of the Plan Foncier Rural. The Plan Foncier Rural, and the study was done looking at the period from 2006 to 2011, does something very interesting. There, the communities have land rights. They're the people who own the rights. That's not changed by the law. But the plan is designed so within that community, the community gets together and maps the individual parcels and land rights of each of the different families and individuals, and it marks them and helps to put in demarcation and cornerstones of some part. It also has a documenting part where the community itself gives these people some certificates. Well, this study that was done looked at the first two parts, the mapping and the marking by the community, and they found that within 2 years, just by mapping and marking the parcels, no land tenure change, no new law, the households were planting 43% more trees, and that the gender gap between women and men in allowing natural regeneration, in allowing their forests to grow back, had practically disappeared. Once women were sure that their land rights were secure because the community had all agreed, they were willing to let the fallow and secondary forests come back. Next, please. Now, if we move a little bit from the questions of tenure to the questions of overregulation, we can look at the situation of community forestry in Mexico. Mexico is probably the country in the world that has advanced the most, that is in the vanguard, really, of recognizing community tenure rights over forests and supporting community forestry enterprises, and needs a lot of praise for that. But in recent years, there's been a growing problem of overregulation. Even though the communities have the land rights and they have in theory the rights to manage their forests, we have officials who are arbitrarily deciding that they shouldn't be allowed to log as much timber as their management plan says. We're finding that the law enforcement efforts are focusing increasingly on ensuring that the community forestry enterprises do everything to the last detail, rather than focusing on stopping the illegal forestry that has no permits at all. We're finding, and particularly with the COVID pandemic, that it's becoming harder and longer and more difficult to get forest management plans and permits, requires frequent trips. You go to town and the people aren't there. You have long delays to get response. And that creates a situation where it's very easy for forestry officials to demand from community forestry enterprises, we need a bribe to make this work a little bit faster. So in situations like that, community forestry enterprises start to say, why bother? Why manage this forest at all? Why grow trees? Why not just focus on crops and livestock? Next, please. And in Africa, we have what for me is a really kind of an amazing situation. And that's with the charcoal situation in urban sub-Saharan Africa. Charcoal is the main source of household energy for cooking in much of urban sub-Saharan Africa. Almost all of that charcoal is illegal. Very little of it has formal permit, and the illegality clearly hasn't stopped people from selling the charcoal. It hasn't stopped them harvesting the charcoal, and it certainly hasn't done anything to make these systems more sustainable. What it has done is it's made it harder to organize the producers so that they can move to more sustainable systems, and it's encouraged corruption. And producing legally is currently too costly. It's complicated to get permits. It's complicated to do all these things. So people just simply produce illegally, unsustainably. And we're in a situation where what could be a huge opportunity for forest landscape restoration, sustainable production of all sorts of trees for charcoal, is being missed. So now in a number of countries, Zambia is one that we're familiar with, but they're talking about it in many other countries, producer guarantee schemes of organizing the charcoal harvesters, coming to an agreement with the organized groups of how they're going to manage their charcoal, and getting the government to, if not legalize it, to look the other way and work with it, is showing some real promise for lowering costs and improving sustainability. Next, please. Next slide, please. So what are my overall messages that I want to leave with you here? The first message, and the reason we're having this talk at all, is because land tenure security and regulation are extremely important for forest landscape restoration. But land tenure security is not the same thing as just simply having an official title. Land tenure security is as much about, are these titles being enforced? If there's no title, do people feel secure? Are other people affecting their security? And so we shouldn't be focusing so much on the law or the legal title, but what is creating a condition where farmers feel secure to plant trees, to allow trees to naturally grow, particularly groups that have less power in the community. Maybe they're women, maybe they're migrants, maybe they're groups that are on the outside. How will they feel more secure so that they're willing to take the steps for forest landscape restoration? And a lot of the innovations there have to do with education, informal mediation, and simply documenting what the community itself has agreed on so that people feel more secure and that that conversation has been had, and that it has, people can say, but you promised and this is what this says. And to have innovations that look at different types of reconciliation. And we've also seen that it's not just about laws, it's about attitudes. Attitudes about women, attitudes about indigenous peoples, attitudes that need to change, attitudes about the idea that if there's a forest there, instead of a crop, that somehow the land is being unused and it shouldn't have land rights. So part of this whole process is not just changing the legality, it's changing people's minds. It's changing people's attitudes. Next, please. Next slide, please. And then finally, when we get to regulation, the key point is that you can go a long way with self-regulation. There's no way that the governments of Latin America or Africa or Asia can be out in every forest looking at what's going on. But when you organize the communities, when you organize charcoal harvesters, when you organize community forestry enterprises, when you work with traditional authorities, they are in a situation where you can self-regulate and where you can provide them incentives to say, if you're managing this well, we're not going to bother you. We're going to focus on the people who are causing the worst problems, who are causing the worst offenders. If community forestry enterprises are the ones that get the most attention from forestry officials who are trying to impose the regulation, all that does is it sends a strong signal. Don't join a community forestry enterprise. Do this illegally, do this on the margins, do this quietly, pay the bribes. So communities can police themselves, and if governments support that effort, we're going to reach better solutions. And if we want to promote legality, we have to reduce the cost of being legal. Those costs are not just the taxes, it's also the bribes, it's also the time spent, it's also the delays in getting permits. If we want to promote legality, we have to be serious about making this easier for people to work legally. And if we do that, we will open the door to more restoration. Thank you very much. And once again, I want to congratulate WRI for this effort, and I want to thank everyone for inviting me here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very important points that you made about the policies and barriers and the over-regulation and others that are sometimes not really well understood and are important to address. I would like to then move to our next keynote speaker that we'll have for the session, Dr. Jennifer Alex Garcia. She's a professor of applied economics at Oregon State University. She has worked on the evaluation of policies on forest conservation efforts in Mexico, Brazil, and globally. And she has a PhD from University of California in Berkeley, and the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. And she was working at other universities such as University of Montana, University of San Francisco, and University of Wisconsin-Madison. Right now, she's the head of the Department of Applied Economics and Director of Sustainability double degree program at Oregon State University. So Jennifer, thanks for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have you here. And you will look at this from a more economic perspective, very related to what David was saying, but with an angle on incentives. So please, Jennifer, the floor is yours, and you will control your presentation, right?
Great, thank you very much, Renee. Is that showing up correctly?
Yes,
all right, excellent. So first, I want to thank WRI for inviting me to spend a few minutes talking with you. I'm really very honored to be here. And I want to thank David for this excellent and illuminating talk, which actually very nicely dovetails with what I'm going to say. I'm going to focus my remarks today on how we might think about incentives to support forests, focusing on how we can change benefits and costs to forest owners or potential forest owners in order to end up with more forest. So I realize I'm doing a little bit of preaching to the choir here. I don't think you would have logged on if you weren't pro-forest, but I think it's important to remind ourselves about the services that forest provides. So this is really important for two reasons. First, it helps us think about what we are giving up when we trade forests for other land use. And second, it helps us understand what and to whom these services are provided, which can give us a sense of who might want to pay to conserve or restore them. So I think we've all heard a lot about carbon sequestration capacity, and almost as much about the treasure trove of biodiversity that's provided by forests. These are global public goods. They're enjoyed by countries all over the world, even when they're produced by a piece of forest in Brazil or Cameroon or Vietnam. And they're also the justification for international financing of at least part of natural solutions to climate change. Forests also provide services more locally. The simple presence of forests and the shade they provide can increase worker productivity for those who work outdoors, which has been shown in Indonesia. The figure on the top right of this slide shows how much tree cover reduces urban heat in different cities across the United States, a number that ranges from 0.2 to over 1.5 degrees Celsius. We know from work in Brazil and Indonesia that forest presence also reduces the incidence of a number of diseases. And there's evidence from China that shows how forests can reduce soil erosion and subsequent dam sedimentation. And ecologists have long established that mangrove stands can help mitigate the impacts of storm surge from hurricanes. This list is by no means complete. However, it's illustrative of the breadth of services that are provided by forests and also of the central characteristic of these services, which is that the people who own and manage these forests cannot capture all the benefits themselves. They share them with other people, often with all of us, and they're usually uncompensated for those shared services. So this leads me to my next point. The reason why we need to talk about incentives for restoration is precisely this issue that the owners don't enjoy the full benefits provided by their forests. This is because forests are different from other assets. They suffer from a market failure because the owner of the forest doesn't face the right incentives. They don't reap all the benefits from their forest, but they have to pay the full cost of any conservation or restoration activity. The forest owner's choice can be represented by the items that are on this scale. They may experience some direct benefits from conserving or restoring forests, non-timber products, agroforestry production, or shade for resting. They definitely pay the cost for having that forest there. They have to give up what they might have earned by doing something else. They might have to pay the cost for protecting the forest from livestock or from theft. And they experience only a tiny share of all the other benefits from the forest. So those benefits are not on the scale: the carbon, biodiversity, reduced disease burden, all the things that I mentioned before. We sometimes call these kinds of benefits ecosystem or environmental services. In a world where we proceed with the status quo, where the producer only considers the items on the scale, there's unlikely to be restoration at the level that we as a society would like. We'd like an amount of forest that takes into account the full scope of the benefits it provides. If we do nothing, we will likely continue to lose forests, and we'll only see restoration in those places where agriculture is being abandoned due to job opportunities elsewhere. So policies or tweaks, like the kind of interventions that David was talking about, can be used to tilt this scale in favor of forest. Effective policy interventions can increase benefits or decrease costs or both. There are tons of ways to put your fingers on the scale, and I'm going to name a few here and then give you a few concrete examples 2 slides from now. So we've already heard about improved tenure security or changes in the bundle of property rights that are given to people who use land. But to frame this within the scales of restoration, one way of thinking about it is that clearer rights to land enable landholders to better capture the benefits that forests provide. Another intervention that can increase benefits of keeping or restoring forests is simply to pay people to do so. You can think of this as giving the landholder some monetary value that represents those benefits provided by their forests, but that the market doesn't capture. Putting limits on production via protected areas or other mandates increases the relative benefits of standing forests by reducing the benefits of alternative land uses. And things like fines for deforestation, and in some cases, taxation of forest products, can operate in a similar way. They change the relative attractiveness of activities. Another policy approach is to decrease the cost of conservation or restoration. This includes subsidizing tree nurseries and other inputs into forest, using grants or tax incentives. The cost of restoration can also be decreased by increasing knowledge. It's always less costly to do something when you know a little bit more about how to do it. Learning lowers costs. And a final example of a policy that can decrease the cost of restoration is to build on existing native seed banks, which decreases the cost of inputs and also of maintenance. I am going to give more concrete examples of forest policy, but I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that a big money saver in terms of investment is to actually avoid deforestation rather than to try to put the forest back once you've gotten rid of it. The figure on the left here is from a recently published paper in Nature Climate Change, and it shows a bunch of lines which illustrate the cost of forest-related removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this speaks directly to the natural climate solutions question. The x-axis shows the amount of carbon, and the y-axis gives